Tim. Because what you are describing is a theological myth, a deliberate historical erasure. Darian. Erasure? We are talking about the core identity of the movement. Jesus was an impoverished wanderer. He had no money. His apostles had no money. They lived entirely on faith. That is not a myth. That is the foundation of the entire text. Tim. They lived on capital. Elite, aristocratic capital. Darian. That contradicts everything we know. The man literally said he had nowhere to lay his head. You are trying to turn a grassroots spiritual revival into a funded political campaign. Marcus. And that is exactly where the romanticized version of history falls apart. Because when you actually look at the financial infrastructure behind this movement, you realize why Herod's court backed him. And more importantly, why Rome was terrified of his wealth. Tim. The Romans did not crucify a penniless philosopher over Jewish theological disputes. They crucified a man who was siphoning off royal wealth to build an unsanctioned network. Darian. Royal wealth? From where? Who was giving him royal wealth? Tim. From the highest levels of the Herodian treasury. Marcus. For generations, standard Sunday school curricula have painted the exact same picture: a carpenter with dust on his sandals, walking through Galilee, followed by 12 equally destitute fishermen. A movement built purely on poverty and a total rejection of worldly possessions. It is a beautiful image. It is also historically incomplete. Darian. Which makes sense. That is the entire ethos of the Gospels. They were outsiders. They were rejected by the establishment. You cannot be an outsider if you have the establishment paying your bills. It completely undermines the message. Tim. They were not outsiders in the way you think, and they were definitely not broke. They had a complex patronage system operating right under the nose of the Roman Empire. Darian. Look, I understand the desire to find hidden political angles, but the text itself tells us who was with him. Simple people, fishermen, tax collectors who walked away from their booths. Where is this supposed wealth coming from? Tim. You are looking at the front men. You are entirely ignoring the people who actually paid for the operation. Darian. Nobody paid for it. They relied on hospitality. People opened their homes. That is how wandering preachers survived in the 1st century. It was a culture of charity. Marcus. That is how solitary philosophers survived. But a movement of this size, moving constantly across provincial borders, feeding hundreds of people, organizing logistics in multiple cities, that requires underwriting. It requires a supply chain. You do not move a crowd of that size through ancient Judea on charity alone. Tim. And it requires someone with very deep pockets to keep that chain moving without drawing the immediate wrath of the local prefect. Darian. So who was paying? If the apostles were poor, who was writing the checks? Tim. Turn to the Gospel of Luke. Chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. It names the financial backbone explicitly, but you probably skipped right over it because the English translation was deliberately softened to protect the myth of poverty. Darian. I know the passage. It mentions some women who were cured of evil spirits. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna. It says they helped him out of their own means. That means they cooked. They mended clothes. They provided domestic support. Tim. Cooking? You think a woman like Joanna was washing tunics in the Jordan River? Darian. Why wouldn't she? If she was a devoted follower, she would serve the movement in whatever capacity she could. Humility was part of the teaching. Marcus, because of who her husband was. You cannot understand Joanna without understanding her marriage. Her marriage is the key to the entire financial structure of the movement. Joanna was the wife of Chuza. Darian. Okay, And who is Chuza? Why does that matter? Tim. Chuza was the epitropos of Herod Antipas. Darian. The epitropos? What does that even mean? Marcus. The chief financial administrator. The royal steward. The man who literally held the keys to the Herodian treasury in Galilee. He was one of the most powerful and wealthy men in the entire region. Tim Joanna was not a peasant making bread. She was high-level aristocracy. She possessed independent wealth and massive social status. She was part of the inner circle of the Herodian court. Darian? Wait. Are you saying the wife of Herod's chief financial officer was funding a rogue preacher? That makes zero sense. Why would she risk her position? Tim, I am saying Richard Bauckham, in his analysis of gospel women, demonstrated exactly that. Joanna used her resources to underwrite the movement logistically and financially. She was not a maid. She was a major donor. Darian. Okay, I have to admit that this detail about Chuza is interesting, but a single data point does not prove a massive financial conspiracy. The text just says they provided for them, helped them. That could mean anything from offering a guest room to giving them a few coins for the road. Tim, you are reading the English translation. Let's look at the Greek. The original text uses the Greek imperfect verb diakonaun, Darian, which translates to serving, like a deacon, serving tables. It implies humble service. Tim, wrong. Joni Taylor and Helen K. Bond, in their 2022 study Women Remembered, completely dismantled that assumption. In first-century Greco-Roman culture, the verb diakonoun, when applied to individuals of high status expending resources, does not mean domestic service. It signifies formal patronal underwriting. Marcus. The technical term is euergetism. It is the ancient Mediterranean system of patronage where wealthy elites fund public works, philosophical movements, or political clients in exchange for honor, loyalty, and social influence. Tim. Exactly. They were not serving him dinner. They were acting as legal patrons. They were underwriting his entire campaign across Galilee. Darian. That is a massive leap. You are taking a single verb and turning it into a corporate sponsorship. You are applying modern financial concepts to an ancient religious group. Tim. It is not a leap. Look at the rest of the sentence in Luke 8:3. It says they funded them, quote, out of their private possessions. The Greek phrase is ekton hyparchontōn autais. Marcus. That is not colloquial language. That is standard legal terminology for aristocrats expending private capital. It refers to vast estates, property, and substantial financial assets. Darian, I need a second. You are telling me that the biblical text explicitly states that elite aristocratic women from the Herodian court were using their private fortunes to finance Jesus? Tim, yes. Darian. And we have been taught for 2,000 years that they were just humble women cooking meals? Why would the church change that? Tim. Because a penniless, humble savior is much easier to digest than a politically backed operator with a sophisticated financial infrastructure. The medieval church needed a theology of poverty, so they erased the wealthy female patrons who actually built the movement. Darian? But Jesus preached poverty. He literally said, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." In Matthew 8:20. That proves he was completely destitute. Marcus. That is exactly how modern readers interpret it. But in first-century Greco-Roman rhetoric, especially among itinerant philosophers, having nowhere to lay one's head did not mean absolute economic destitution. It indicated a voluntarily mobile lifestyle. It meant operating without a single fixed homestead. Tim. You do not need a fixed homestead when you have an ongoing patronal support network paying for your travel, your lodging, and your supplies. The Greek imperfect tense in Luke 8 means this funding was continuous. It never stopped. Darian. But let's go back to Joanna for a second. If she was so wealthy, why didn't the Romans just arrest her? Why go after Jesus? Tim. Because of the rules of patronage. In the Roman world, a patron was untouchable if their client took the fall. Joanna was the wife of Chuza. Arresting the wife of the Herodian epitropos would have sparked a diplomatic crisis between the Roman prefect and the court of Herod Antipas. Pilate could not touch her directly. Marcus, but he could cut off the head of the movement she was funding. Darian. That is fascinating. So Jesus was the vulnerable target. Tim. Exactly. He was the public face, the charismatic leader. But the infrastructure? That was hidden in plain sight. Think about the logistics required to feed 5,000 people, or even just moving a core group of 70 disciples across the Galilean countryside. That requires organized supply chains. It requires local agents purchasing food. It requires safe houses. Darian. And you are saying Joanna and Susanna and Mary Magdalene were the ones managing that supply chain? Tim. Yes, they were the logistical backbone. The Greek term diakonon encompasses administration. They were the administrators of the movement's treasury. Marcus. And this is verified by the fact that Judas Iscariot is later described as keeping the money bag. There was a money bag. There was a treasury. You don't need a treasurer if you don't have capital. Darian. True. I always glossed over that detail. If they were absolutely broke, what was Judas stealing from? Tim. Exactly. He was stealing from the funds provided by these elite women. Funds that were meant to sustain the movement's operations and support the destitute in their network, creating a welfare system that bypassed the Roman state. Marcus. And that welfare system is another form of illicit patronage. When you start feeding the poor with Herodian money outside of Roman supervision, you are buying the loyalty of the masses. You are creating a state within a state. Darian? So it really was a direct political challenge, not by raising an army of soldiers, but by raising an army of dependents. Tim. Which, in the ancient world, is exactly how you build an army of soldiers eventually. Rome knew how this story ended if they didn't stop it early. Marcus. And this is where the conversation shifts, because once you accept that the movement was heavily funded by Herodian court insiders, you have to ask the most dangerous question of all. Darian. What question? Tim. What did Rome think about it? Darian. Rome didn't care about Jewish religious movements. They let them argue over the law all the time. They had thousands of wandering preachers and self-proclaimed prophets in Judea. As long as they kept the peace, Rome ignored them. Tim. Exactly. As long as they kept the peace. But a religious philosopher arguing about the Sabbath is one thing. A charismatic leader operating in Galilee, backed by unsanctioned capital from the royal Herodian treasury? That is something entirely different. Darian. Why? Why would Pontius Pilate care if some rich woman was giving away her own money? It's her money. It's not a Roman problem. Marcus. Because in the Roman Empire, money was never just money. Money was power. Money was the ability to mobilize crowds. Money was the ability to create loyalty that bypassed the emperor. Tim, Martin Hengel, and Bruce Molina explain this perfectly in their work on property and wealth in early Christianity. In Mediterranean patron-client dynamics, attracting Herodian court patrons signaled to Roman provincial officials that a movement possessed dangerous political and financial backing. It meant they were not just a peasant devotion, they were a funded operation. Darian. But they weren't building an army. They were preaching parables. They were healing the sick. How does healing the sick threaten the Roman Empire? Tim. The Romans didn't care about the preaching. They cared about the network. They cared about thousands of people gathering outside of official imperial channels, being fed and organized by resources that normally belonged to the Herodian state. Marcus, under Roman law, any organized group that operated outside of imperial sanction was viewed with extreme suspicion. They were classified as collegia. Tim and Anthony Ledon's recent analysis of Roman political economy changes everything here. Roman provincial prefects viewed non-sanctioned financial patronage networks as illicit collegia. Darian, illicit, just for gathering? Tim, yes, because they threatened the one thing Rome cared about more than anything else in the provinces. Darian, which was what? Tim, tributum, imperial taxation. Darian, wait, you are connecting Joanna's money to Roman taxes? How does that work? This feels like a stretch. A massive stretch. Marcus, by creating a parallel economy. When elite wealth is funneled into an unsanctioned movement, instead of being circulated through approved imperial or local channels, it represents a loss of control. It represents social power shifting away from the emperor and toward an unauthorized leader. Tim and Pilate's entire job, his only real mandate in Judea, was to ensure the smooth collection of tributum and prevent sedition. Anything that disrupted the flow of wealth or created independent loyalties was classified as treason. Darian, I don't know about this. I understand the argument, but this feels too big. Jesus never told people to stop paying taxes. He famously said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's." He explicitly avoided the tax issue. Tim, did he? Or was that a brilliant rhetorical evasion to avoid immediate arrest by informants in a public setting? Marcus, you have to look at what the authorities actually charged him with when they finally brought him before Pilate. Darian, the charges were blasphemy. He claimed to be the Son of God. The high priests brought him to Pilate because he was committing religious crimes against Jewish law. That is the consensus of 2,000 years of history. Marcus, remember what you said at the beginning? Tim, you said Pilate executed him for religious blasphemy against Jewish law. You said they crucified a penniless wanderer over theology. Marcus, and that is exactly what the traditional narrative wants you to focus on. But read the actual legal charges recorded in the Gospel of Luke. Chapter 23, verse 2. Tim, the Jewish authorities bring him to Pilate, and what do they say? Do they say, he broke the Sabbath? Do they say, he claims to be the Messiah? Darian, I don't know the exact phrasing off the top of my head, but it was about him calling himself a king. Tim, we found this man subverting our nation and opposing payment of taxes to Caesar. Darian, Marcus, opposing payment of taxes. Tim, it was never about theology for the Romans. Roman provincial law under Tiberius explicitly ignored internal Jewish religious blasphemy. John 18:31 confirms this. Pilate literally tells them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." Darian, but they didn't. They insisted Pilate execute him. They pushed for crucifixion, which is a Roman punishment, not a Jewish one. Tim, because they knew Pilate didn't care about their religious laws, but Pilate cared deeply about a rogue patronage network, funded by Herodian elites, that was actively subverting the economic order and threatening tributum. That is why they brought up taxes. They knew exactly which button to push to force a Roman execution. Darian, I still struggle with the idea of Pilate caring about local Galilean politics. He was a Roman prefect. Galilee was under Herod Antipas's jurisdiction, not Pilate's. Pilate controlled Judea. Tim, that is exactly why it was a problem. Jesus was bringing Galilean wealth, Herodian wealth, across the border into Judea. He was marching into Jerusalem, Pilate's territory, during the most volatile week of the year, Passover, backed by money from a rival jurisdiction. Marcus, It was a jurisdictional nightmare for Pilate, and it explains why Pilate initially tried to send Jesus to Herod Antipas when he found out Jesus was Galilean. Luke 23, verse 7. Pilate realized the political minefield he was in. Darian. Wait, Pilate sent him to Herod because of the money? Tim. Pilate sent him to Herod because Jesus was Herod's subject, and Pilate suspected Herod's court, via Joanna, was secretly funding him to destabilize Judea. Pilate thought Antipas was playing a shadow game against him. Darian. Oh my God. That changes the entire dynamic of that trial. It wasn't just Pilate trying to pass the buck. Pilate was testing Herod to see if Herod would protect his own asset. Marcus. And when Herod sent Jesus back, dressed in an elegant robe, Herod was sending a message. He is not my agent. Do what you want with him. Tim. It was a game of high-stakes political chess, and Jesus was the pawn caught between the Roman prefect and the Galilean tetrarch, with Joanna's money acting as the catalyst that sparked the entire crisis. Darian. This is uncomfortable. Marcus. It should be. Darian. You are saying that the entire trial before Pontius Pilate was not a debate about divine kingship. It was a crackdown on an illegal financial coalition. It was about money. Tim. When Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" he is not asking a theological question. He is asking a political and economic one. He is asking, "Are you claiming the right to collect taxes and distribute patronage in this province?" Darian. And because Jesus had Joanna, because he had the wife of the Herodian steward backing him, Pilate couldn't just dismiss him as a crazy peasant. Pilate knew where the money was coming from. Tim. Exactly. A crazy peasant doesn't have the wife of the royal treasurer in his entourage. A crazy peasant doesn't have ekton hyparchontōn autais underwriting his logistics. Pilate saw the money. He saw the Herodian connection, and he saw a threat that had to be neutralized immediately. Marcus. Let's look deeper into what the Herodian court actually represented in Galilee, because the assumption is often that Herod Antipas was just a local king with a small budget. Tim, far from it. Archaeological excavations at Tiberias and Magdala, combined with historical re-evaluations of first-century Herodian administrative centers, reveal luxurious villas and fiscal mints belonging to Herodian estate managers. Darian mints? They were making their own money? Tim. They were managing vast agricultural estates and controlling the flow of local currency. Scholars at the Oxford Early Christian Studies Symposium have noted that financial resources gathered through royal Herodian tax distribution in Galilee were directly diverted by estate families. Darian, diverted? By families like Chuza's? Tim. Yes, diverted to sustain Jesus's public campaign. This wasn't just some spare change from the royal purse. This was structural wealth being redirected from the state apparatus into an unsanctioned religious movement. Darian. That is treason. In any ancient empire, diverting state funds to a charismatic leader is treason. Marcus. And that is exactly what Pilate saw. He didn't see a healer. He saw a financial leak that was creating a massive alternative power structure in a volatile province. Darian. I came into this conversation thinking I knew the story. I thought the poverty was the point, that he rejected all wealth and power to show a different way, that his absolute destitution was what made him holy. Tim. He didn't reject wealth. He weaponized it. He used elite resources to build a movement that completely bypassed the Roman economic structure. He built a parallel society funded by the very people Rome relied on to collect taxes. Darian. But why would Joanna do it? If she was risking everything, her status, her husband's life, why divert Herodian funds to this specific rabbi? Tim. Because euergetism, patronage, was how you gained honor in the ancient world. But typically, you funded a temple, or a public bathhouse, or a gladiator game. Joanna chose to fund a movement that was radically redefining social boundaries. Marcus, she wasn't just giving money, she was buying into a new vision of Israel, but she was doing it with the empire's money. Darian, I don't have a good answer for this. It is written right there in Luke 8. It is written right there in the charges in Luke 23. The evidence is literally in the text I have read my entire life. Marcus, it has been hiding in plain sight for 2 millennia. Darian, I can't refute this. And honestly, I don't want to try anymore. It actually makes the history make sense. It explains why a massive empire bothered to execute a carpenter from Galilee. Because he wasn't just a carpenter anymore. He was a heavily funded political force. Tim, it makes the history dangerous again. It stops being a fairy tale about a poor wandering teacher and becomes a high-stakes political thriller. Darian, yes, if he was just a poor preacher, his death is a tragedy, a misunderstanding. But if he was a patronized leader threatening the imperial economy with a network of elite wealth, his death was a calculated political assassination by the state. Marcus, and that is the core of it. We have spent centuries sanitizing the financial reality of the first century because it makes us comfortable. We prefer a savior with empty pockets because an impoverished martyr demands nothing of our own economic structures. We like the myth of the penniless wanderer because it asks nothing of our own bank accounts. But the historical record tells a different story. Tim, the historical record shows a movement that understood exactly how power worked in Roman Judea. They understood euergetism, they understood patronage, and they used the resources of the establishment to subvert the establishment. Darian, it makes you wonder what else has been softened in translation. If diakonoun was translated as cooking and serving instead of patronal underwriting, what other financial realities of the early church have been erased by medieval theologians? Marcus, almost all of them. The early church was an economic powerhouse. It had to be, to survive the persecutions. But as it became the official religion of the Roman Empire, it needed to distance itself from its origins as an illicit, tax-subverting collegium. Tim, so they rewrote their own history. They turned the powerful aristocratic women who funded them into humble domestic servants. They turned a sophisticated logistical operation into a miracle of spontaneous charity. Darian, they erased Joanna. They kept her name, but they erased her power. Tim, they had to. Admitting that elite women funded the foundation of Christianity gives them a power the later, male-dominated church was terrified to acknowledge. If Joanna was the primary financial patron, she had immense authority in the early movement, authority that later bishops desperately wanted to claim for themselves. Darian, I entered this discussion with one certainty, that Jesus had no money, and that was the whole point of his ministry. I am leaving with a completely different certainty. And the second one is infinitely more profound. He had access to immense wealth, and he used it to challenge the greatest empire on earth. Marcus, if you understand who funded him, stand. You understand why Rome feared him. Tim, and you understand why they had to erase the women who made it all possible. Marcus, for those who asked where to go deeper into these suppressed histories, everything I found that did not fit in a video, the full primary textual evidence, and the legal records regarding Roman patronage and tributum is in the Spinoza Forever Library. 5 volumes, every source verifiable. The link is in the pinned comment. Make of it what you will. Darian, I am still trying to process the magnitude of this. The entire narrative of the poor, wandering apostles was essentially a theological cover-up. Tim, a cover-up that worked perfectly for 2,000 years, because it appealed to our desire for a purely spiritual religion, completely divorced from the dirty realities of politics and money. Marcus. The irony is that modern prosperity preachers distort this exact same history. They try to use the wealth of Joanna to justify buying private jets, completely missing the point that this wealth was not used for personal luxury. It was deployed to fund a resistance network. And traditional sermons swing to the opposite extreme, pretending he did not have a single coin to his name, turning him into a passive victim. Tim. Both extremes neutralize the actual historical threat he posed. The truth is much more intimidating. The truth is that he was a master strategist who leveraged the wealth of his enemies against them. Darian. That is a Jesus I have never met in any church, but it is the one clearly visible in the historical record. Marcus. Exactly. If this conversation challenged what you thought you knew, subscribing ensures the algorithm brings you back for the next layer, because we have many more historical constructs to dismantle. Marcus. I want to know where you stand now. Did the reality of the Herodian court funding change how you view the trial before Pilate? Comment below. The conversation continues there.